June 4th, 1942. 10:26 in the morning. The Pacific Ocean. A single dive bomber drops out of the sky at 19,000 feet. The pilot's name is Dick Best. He is 32 years old. He is a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. And he is alone. 30 seconds ago, he had a squadron behind him. Men he had trained himself. Men who knew his hand signals. Men who had flown with him for 2 years. They are gone now. Not shot down. Not turned back. They followed someone else. What is left? 2 wingmen. 3 planes total, diving toward the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ship below him is the Akagi, Japan's carrier flagship. Full anti-aircraft batteries. A combat air patrol of 0 fighters somewhere above. And on her bridge, a fleet admiral. The one man in the Japanese Navy that the officers around him said could not be replaced. Dick Best didn't know that. He did not know that man's name. He knew one thing. The bomb bay doors were open, his thumb was on the release, and he was not going to pull out. When he landed that morning, he walked below decks and coughed up blood. He went to sick bay. He was told to rest. Then word came that one Japanese carrier was still operational, still launching planes, still fighting. Dick Best got out of the bed, asked which aircraft was ready, and flew again. Same day. Midway has been told 100 times. This is not the version most people know. This is the story of what it cost the man who was actually there. Here is something the history books rarely say about the Battle of Midway. Japan did not go into that fight blind. They did not go in reckless. They went in with the best carrier admiral they had ever produced, and the best carrier force they had ever assembled. To understand what Dick Best did that morning, you have to understand what he was flying into. His name was Tamon Yamaguchi. By the summer of 1942, the officers who served alongside him in the Imperial Japanese Navy had arrived at a quiet consensus, not in a press release, not in a ceremony, in the way officers talk among themselves when they think no one is writing it down. If something happened to Yamamoto, there was one man who should take command of the combined fleet. One man. That was the weight Yamaguchi carried into the Battle of Midway. He was not what Americans expected a Japanese admiral to look like. He had lived in the United States, not a brief visit, 2 years. Princeton University, 1921 to 1923. He read English. He read American newspapers. He sat in American classrooms and learned American history from American professors. Then he went home, graduated from the Naval Staff College with honors, and spent the next decade working his way up through a Navy that was building itself toward a war with the country he had just studied. In 1934, he came back. This time as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, D.C., he stayed 3 years. He watched American shipyards. He attended American fleet exercises. He read American military journals. When Yamaguchi finally left Washington in 1937, he was the last Japanese naval officer to hold that post before the war began. He had seen more of America than almost any officer in the Imperial Navy. He was not the kind of man who underestimated what he had seen. When the Pearl Harbor attack was being planned in 1941, the original assignment left Yamaguchi's carrier division out of the strike force. He did not accept that quietly. A pilot named Mitsuo Fuchida, who was there, described what happened next. Yamaguchi had been drinking. He went directly to the quarters of Vice Admiral Nagumo, the man commanding the attack. He got in his face. He argued, loudly, that his division had to be part of the strike. The argument worked. His 2 carriers, Hiryu and Soryu, were added to the force. That was the kind of man he was. He knew his value. He fought for his place in the line. And when Pearl Harbor happened, his pilots were among the best trained in the entire fleet, because he had pushed them harder than anyone thought was reasonable. He knew what the mission was worth. He made sure his men were ready for it. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, The Japanese carrier force, 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, was closing on Midway Island. That morning, a Japanese scout plane sent a message back to the fleet. American ships sighted, possibly a carrier among them. Yamaguchi read the message on the bridge of Hiryu. He sent a signal immediately to Nagumo, who was commanding from the flagship Akagi. Attack now. Use whatever is on deck. Do not wait to rearm. The planes sitting on the Japanese carrier decks at that moment were loaded with bombs for a second strike on Midway Island. Not the anti-ship torpedoes you'd want against a carrier. Yamaguchi knew that. He was telling Nagumo, "It doesn't matter. Hit them now. Bombs will still do damage. Every minute we wait is a minute we are sitting still." Nagumo did not take the advice. He chose to wait. Rearm the planes with torpedoes first. Strike properly. On the carriers, crews began the process of switching out the ordnance. Bombs were pulled off the planes. Torpedoes were loaded on. The rearmed aircraft were brought up to the flight deck. Fuel lines were run. It took time. And in that time, while Japanese sailors were moving bombs and torpedoes across hangar decks, while aircraft sat parked and fueled and waiting, something was happening 200 miles to the east that Nagumo did not know about. Yamaguchi knew the risk. He had said so. He stood on the bridge of Hiryu and waited. At around 10:22 that morning, American dive bombers appeared overhead. In the space of roughly 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were hit. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, all 3 burning within minutes of each other. On the Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo had to be physically helped off his bridge. His flagship was on fire from the inside out. He transferred his flag to a cruiser. Hiryu was the only carrier left. Yamaguchi did not pause. He ordered an immediate counterstrike. 18 Val dive bombers launched within minutes. They found the American carrier Yorktown. 3 bombs hit. Yorktown shuddered, slowed, started to list. Yamaguchi received the damage report. He ordered a second wave. Torpedo bombers this time. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown. When the list passed 26 degrees, Buckmaster ordered his crew to abandon ship. At that moment, Hiryu still operational, a second American carrier attack group not yet located, 1 American carrier dead in the water. Tamon Yamaguchi was the most dangerous man on the Pacific Ocean. He had just done what no one else in his fleet had managed to do all morning. He had hit back, and he was not finished. But there was something he did not know. Scouts had found Hiryu, and on the USS Enterprise, far to the east, a lieutenant commander who had just walked off a flight deck and coughed up blood had just gotten out of a sick bay bed and asked which aircraft was ready to fly. Dick Best was not famous. Not before Midway. Not after it, either. He was a squadron commander, a trainer, the kind of officer other pilots trusted because he never asked them to do something he had not already figured out how to do himself. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1932. Not at the top, not with a famous name attached to him. He had put in the years, carriers instructing, more carriers. By 1940, he was assigned to Bombing Squadron 6, VB-6, aboard the USS Enterprise. He worked his way up to squadron commander by the time the war started. The men who flew under him described him the same way, consistently. Cold in the air. Not cold as in distant, cold as in contained. He did not raise his voice in the cockpit. He did not give speeches on the flight deck. What he gave his pilots was something more useful, the conviction that he had already thought through everything that could go wrong and had a plan for it. That was the kind of commander a man wanted to follow into a dive. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Enterprise was at sea, returning to Pearl Harbor. Best was aboard. He heard the radio traffic. He did not learn the full extent of what had happened until the ship finally came in, and the men stood on deck and looked at what was left of the fleet. The Arizona was still burning. The Oklahoma was upside down in the mud. Ships that Best had served on, men he had trained alongside, gone in a Sunday morning while Enterprise was 2 days out. He did not write down what he felt. He went back to work. By the spring of 1942, he had flown combat missions against Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands, at Wake Island, at Marcus Island. Short raids, learning missions, the kind that told you what your aircraft could do and what it could not. The SBD Dauntless was not a glamorous airplane. It was slow. It was loud. The pilots who flew it said it shook the whole way down in a dive and got slower the lower you went. In a dogfight, it was dead. Against a ship, a large ship, sitting still, its crew looking up at a pilot dropping through 2 miles of sky toward a specific point on a specific deck, it was something else entirely. What it had was accuracy. In the hands of a pilot who knew what he was doing, the SBD could put a bomb through a target the size of a tennis court from 15,000 feet. Best had spent 2 years making sure every man in VB6 could do exactly that. He knew what he was doing. They knew what he was doing. That was the agreement between them. The morning of June 4th, 1942, Enterprise began launching her air group at 7:06. Before he ever climbed into the cockpit, Best ran a pre-flight check on his oxygen equipment. Standard procedure. He put on the mask, drew a breath. Something tasted wrong. He cleared it, put the mask back on, decided it was nothing. He had a strike to lead. What he did not know, what no one standing on that flight deck knew, was that the rebreather canister in his SBD was already compromised. The sodium hydroxide used to scrub carbon dioxide from exhaled air had begun releasing caustic fumes. Every breath he drew through that mask at altitude was carrying something into his lungs that his body had no way to stop. He flew on. Several pilots in VB6 reported trouble with their oxygen systems that morning. Best ordered the formation down from 20,000 feet to 15,000. That helped the others. It did not stop what was already happening inside his chest. He did not know. Nobody knew. There was a war to find. The Japanese fleet was not where McCluskey's navigation said it should be. For nearly 2 hours, the Enterprise Air Group flew southwest, then west, searching. Fuel burning down. No target. At 9:55 in the morning, a lookout spotted a lone Japanese destroyer running at high speed toward the northeast. McCluskey, commanding the air group, followed it. The destroyer led them straight to the Japanese fleet. What McCluskey saw below him were the 4 carriers of Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed. Fuel lines running across the hangar decks. The whole thing sitting still in the water, waiting. McCluskey called the attack. He began his dive toward Kaga. Behind him, the rest of the air group followed. VS-6, VB-6, plane after plane peeling off toward the same target. Dick Best watched it happen. His assignment was Akagi, the flagship, the carrier to the north, not Kaga. He signaled his squadron to break off. No one broke off. Pilot after pilot peeled away after McCluskey toward Kaga. Best had been watching his fuel gauge all morning. He knew how long the search had taken. He knew what the dive and the pullout and the flight home would cost. He looked behind him. 2 wingmen were still there. Edwin Kroger on his left. Frederick Weber on his right. 3 planes. The Akagi was below them, her flight deck full, her anti-aircraft guns coming alive. 0 fighters somewhere overhead looking for exactly this. Best did not call it off. He pushed the nose over. There is no record of what he said to Kroger and Weber in those seconds. No radio transcript. No account from any of the 3 men of what passed between them. What there is, the flight path of 3 SBD Dauntlesses dropping from 19,000 feet toward the largest warship in the Japanese carrier force. A dive like this takes about 40 seconds from release altitude to bomb drop. 40 seconds at speeds approaching 250 miles an hour. The airframe shakes. The engine screams. The ship below goes from the size of a thumbnail to the size of a building to the size of the whole world. Anti-aircraft guns track you on the way down. The Zeros, if they catch you in the dive, can follow you part of the way. A pilot in a dive has one job: hold the crosshairs on the target and do not flinch. The anti-aircraft fire was coming up. The Zero fighters were somewhere in the sun. 3 bombs fell on the Akagi in quick succession. 2 missed. 1 did not. Best's 1,600-pound armor-piercing weapon went through the flight deck. It went through the upper deck. It detonated in hangar number 2, in the middle of 18 torpedo bombers that had just been rearmed and refueled and were sitting there, waiting to be brought up. The explosion did not blow out the sides of the ship. It blew up through the deck. Fire came out of the Akagi from the inside. One of the near misses sent a shockwave into the hull that jammed her rudder. Within minutes, secondary explosions were running through the hangar as the fuel and ordnance of the parked aircraft cooked off one after another. Vice Admiral Nagumo, commanding from the Akagi's bridge, was helped off his own flagship. He could not stay. The fires were not going out. The Akagi, the ship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was dying from a single bomb, dropped by a man with 2 wingmen who had been abandoned by his own squadron 30 seconds earlier. Best did not watch it burn. He had a fleet to find his way back to, and his fuel gauge had been running toward empty since before the attack. He pulled out of his dive and turned east. He did not know yet what was happening to the other carriers. He would find out later. At almost the same moment he had released over the Akagi, McCluskey's group had put 4 bombs into Kaga, and from a completely different direction, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie had led Yorktown's dive bombers in and put 3 bombs into Zoryu. 3 carriers, 3 separate attack groups, 6 minutes. None of the 3 groups had coordinated with the others. None of them had planned to arrive at the same moment. The Yorktown group had launched late and taken a shorter route and simply appeared overhead at the same time as the Enterprise planes. If any one of those groups had been 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol might have caught them. They were not 5 minutes off. They were exactly on time, without knowing they were. And the reason the Zeros were not at altitude to stop them, the reason the skies above those carriers were empty, was that for the previous hour, 3 American torpedo squadrons had been flying straight at the Japanese fleet at low altitude. Slow, without fighter cover. Torpedoes that mostly missed. Planes that were shot down, one after another. Waldron's squadron from the Hornet had gone in first. 15 planes, 30 men. 1 came back. Then the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown followed. The same story, the same result. Together, they drew the Zeros down low and kept them there. They cleared the sky above those carriers with the only thing they had left to offer. Best's bomb hit because those men made it possible. He would have known that. He would have known their names. Best landed on Enterprise at around noon. He taxied clear, cut the engine, climbed down from the cockpit. He walked below decks to his stateroom, and he bent over and coughed up a large amount of blood. He did not go back up to report to anyone. He did not stop at the ready room where the other pilots were debriefing. He went directly to sick bay. The doctor had him lie down. While the examination was underway, the after-action reports were coming in. The radio operators were sorting through the transmissions. The intelligence officers were piecing together what had just happened. 3 Japanese carriers. Hit. Burning. One of the largest naval disasters in Japanese history, compressed into 6 minutes. And Dick Best, the man whose bomb had started it, was lying on his back in sick bay, while a doctor pressed a stethoscope to his chest and tried to figure out why he was bleeding into his lungs. The examination was still underway when the word came through. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, untouched, still operational. Yamaguchi had already launched his counterstrike. Yorktown had been hit. Enterprise was assembling a strike for the afternoon. Every pilot who could fly. If you have been watching this and you feel something right now, if this story is landing the way it deserves to land, hit the like button before we go any further. It costs you nothing, and it keeps stories like this from disappearing. Best got out of the bed. The doctor had not cleared him. The examination was still underway. Nobody had told him he could fly. He found a plane that was ready and put his name on it. The afternoon strike launched at around 3:30. Dive bombers from Enterprise's own squadrons, what was left of VB-6 and VS-6 after the morning, alongside 14 Yorktown pilots whose own carrier had just been abandoned, who had nowhere else to land, who climbed into aircraft on a ship that was not theirs and went back out anyway. Think about what that means for a moment. These were men who had watched their carrier take torpedo hits, who had circled in the air while Yorktown listed and her crew went into the water, who had landed on Enterprise because there was no other flight deck to land on. They could have been done for the day. They had every reason to be done for the day. They were not done. When the call went out for the afternoon strike, those Yorktown pilots were in. All 14 of them. Best was with them. The strike was put together from whatever was still flyable. Different squadrons, different carriers, men who had never flown together before that afternoon, assembled into a single attack package on a flight deck that smelled of fuel and spent brass. This time, the flight was kept at lower altitude. By then, enough pilots had reported oxygen system failures that no one trusted the rebreathers. The strike flew lower, more exposure, slower approach, more time inside the anti-aircraft envelope on the way in. Hiryu's crew knew what was coming. They had watched the smoke from their 3 sister carriers all day. They had seen what American dive bombers did when they found a target. Her gunners were not conserving ammunition. Best described it afterward, years later, in a few plain sentences. Hiryu threw everything she had at us. I never tried to look where my bomb hit. She was shooting, the battleships were shooting, and the Zeros were swarming around. He did not look. He held the crosshairs and released. His bomb was one of 4 that found Hiryu's flight deck. In that attack, the force of one of those explosions blew the forward elevator, a steel platform the size of a small house, up into the air, and dropped it against the island, the ship's command structure. The ship began to burn. Weber, Best's wingman from the morning, the man who had flown his right side over the Akagi, was shot down by Japanese fighters during the attack. He had lagged behind the group trying to reform, and the Zeros found him. He didn't make it back. Best did not know that yet when he turned for Enterprise. He would find out when he landed. Yamaguchi assembled what was left of his crew on the flight deck. The fires were not going out. He gave the order to abandon ship. Then he told his men he would not be leaving with them. Captain Kaku, the Hiryu's commanding officer, stayed as well. The crew came up one by one. Some of them argued. Some of them wept. He sent them all away. Hiryu sank in the early morning hours of June 5th. Yamaguchi went down with her. The man the Imperial Japanese Navy had counted on to lead their fleet through whatever came next was at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean by the time the sun came up. Best landed on Enterprise for the last time in his life. He did not know it was the last time. He would not know it for certain for several days. He landed, walked below, and the next thing I knew, he said in 1999, I was in sick bay, coughing up blood. This time, he did not get out of the bed. They transferred him to the hospital at Pearl Harbor. The flight surgeon there ordered X-rays. He looked at them for a while before he said anything. Cloudy patches on both lungs. The oxygen rebreather canister in his SBD had overheated during the long morning flight. The sodium hydroxide used to scrub carbon dioxide from his exhaled air had released caustic fumes directly into his mask. He had been breathing it for hours, somewhere in his lungs, dormant for years without his knowing. He had been carrying a latent tuberculosis infection. The caustic fumes eroded the granuloma that had kept it contained. The tuberculosis activated. This was not a wound you could see. No shrapnel, no burn, no scar that a man could point to and say, "This is where the war got me." What the war had left him was in his lungs, invisible on the outside, and it was going to take everything he had built his career on. "I knew my career was dead," he told an interviewer. "I never flew again." Flying was the only thing, by his own account, he had ever really wanted to do. He had received his wings in December 1935. He had spent every year since then working toward the skill to do it well. And in one morning over the Pacific, without knowing it was happening, he had breathed in the thing that would take it away. 32 months. That is how long the treatment took. 2.5 years in and out of naval hospitals, while the war he had helped turn at Midway continued without him. While he was in those hospitals, the Marines took Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf. The men he had served with, the men VB-6 had flown alongside, kept going. Best could not go with them. Medical retirement in March 1944. 100% disability. He was 33 years old. "I never flew again." 4 words. He said them plainly, the same way he talked about everything. No theater. No bitterness that anyone recorded. Just the fact of it. In a single day, June 4th, 1942, Dick Best had done something no other pilot accomplished in the entire course of the Second World War. He had scored direct hits on 2 enemy aircraft carriers in one day, with 3 planes in the morning, with damaged lungs in the afternoon, without anyone ordering him back into the air. The carrier he hit in the morning, the Akagi, went to the bottom. The carrier he hit in the afternoon, the Hiryu, went to the bottom. The man commanding the Hiryu went down with his ship, and Dick Best never flew again. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. The newspapers wrote about Spruance. They wrote about McCluskey. Best's name appeared in the official records and in the after-action reports, and almost nowhere else. He moved to California. He went to work for Douglas Aircraft, the company that had built the SBD Dauntless he flew. Later he moved to the Rand Corporation, where he worked in security. He lived quietly. When historians finally started tracking him down, and they did eventually, he talked about Midway the way a man talks about a hard day at work. Plainly, without theater. He said the Americans won the battle almost in spite of ourselves. He meant it. He remembered every mistake. McCluskey missing the turn, the air group getting separated, young pilots who ran out of fuel on the way home because the morning had run longer than anyone planned. He did not remember it as a triumph. He remembered it as something that almost didn't work, and then did, and the men it cost to make it work. He lived until October 28th, 2001. He was 91 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. After the war, Japanese officers and historians who studied the Battle of Midway came back, repeatedly, to the same name: Yamaguchi. They wrote that Japan had lost, at Midway, the one carrier admiral who might have changed how the rest of the war was fought, the one who had seen the danger coming and said so, the one whose judgment Nagumo had overruled. They were probably right. But here is what that tells you about the morning of June 4th. Dick Best, on a morning when his own squadron left him, when he had 2 wingmen and no more, when his oxygen system was poisoning him with every breath, and he had no way of knowing it, had just ended the career of the man Japan could not afford to lose. And then, without anyone ordering him to, he went back in the afternoon and finished the job. Think about what happened after Midway. 2 months later, August 1942, United States Marines landed on Guadalcanal. 6 months of fighting in the jungle and in the water around it to hold one airfield. Japan threw everything they had at that island. Ship after ship, wave after wave. They could not take it back. The reason was simple, even if nobody said it plainly at the time. Japan no longer had the carrier air power to control the skies over Guadalcanal. They had lost that on June 4th. The year after that, New Georgia, Bougainville, the long push up the Solomons, each island one step closer. Each battle smaller than the one before, because Japan was running out of the experienced men who could make those battles harder. By 1944, Saipan. When Saipan fell, B-29s could reach Tokyo. Japan had no answer for the B-29 at altitude. They had tried to build one, fighters capable of reaching 30,000 feet. But by then, they were fighting the war with replacement pilots who had months of training where their predecessors had years. The gap showed. Then Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Japan sent everything that was left. They lost. Then Iwo Jima. Then Okinawa. Then August 1945. Every one of those battles happened inside a war that Japan's Navy was losing from the moment it began. Losing from June 4th, 1942. 4 carriers gone. Hundreds of experienced airmen dead. Men who had flown from Pearl Harbor to Coral Sea, to the Indian Ocean. Men whose skill had taken years to build, and who Japan's training system could not replace, fast enough to keep up with the losses that followed. Japan could build new carriers. They could not rebuild those pilots. Not in time. Not at the pace the war was moving. And all of it, every battle in that long chain, traces back to one morning. One pilot. 2 wingmen. A bomb that went through a flight deck and found what was waiting in the hangar below. If your father served in the Pacific after the summer of 1942, if your grandfather was on a ship in those waters, or in the Marines on one of those islands, or flying off a carrier deck in the years that followed, they served in a war whose outcome had already been shaped by people whose names they probably never heard, by men like Dick Best. The men who made the difference were rarely the ones who got the headlines. They were the ones who got back in the airplane. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, or your father, or your uncle, or someone whose name you still carry with you, leave it in the comments. His name, his ship, where he went. And if you remember something he said, at the dinner table, driving home from somewhere, one night when he sat down and talked, and never talked about it again. Write it down here. Not for me. For the person who reads it next week and realizes that man sounds exactly like their grandfather. History records the battles. What your family remembers, that one thing he said that you have never forgotten. That is the part history doesn't get. Don't let it disappear with you.